The Vox grill crackles with static, and through the interference comes a sound no Imperial citizen should ever hear: silence, where the Astronomican should burn. In the warp, Navigators claw at their third eyes, screaming as the beacon they have known since birth flickers like a dying star, then vanishes entirely. This is not the story, you know. This is the nightmare that Terra's rediscovery prevented, the alternate thread of fate, where humanity's cradle remained lost in the dark, and the Imperium that rose to claim the stars did so without ever touching the soil of its birthworld. Imagine an emperor who never returned home. The master of mankind stands aboard the Bucephalus, his flagship cutting through the void between dying suns, and in his hearts, for he possesses more than one, more than any record will confess, there burns a wound that will not heal. Terra remains hidden behind warp storms and gravitational anomalies, locked away by some cruel twist of fate, or perhaps by design of powers that fear what humanity might become. The coordinates are lost. The way is shut. And though he remembers every street of the Imperial palace that has not yet been built, every mountain range and ocean he walked in ages past, he cannot find the path back. The irony tastes like copper and ash in a mouth that has forgotten how to knead sustenance. He has conquered 1,000 worlds, bent alien empires to their knees, and shattered the armies of old night. Yet the one world that matters slips through his fingers like smoke. The Great Crusade continues, but it is a crusade without a heart, a body without a soul. The fleets spread outward from Ulanor, from Olympia, from Chogoris and Fenris, and a dozen other worlds that have become makeshift capitals, temporary thrones for an emperor who refuses to sit still. There is no unity to celebrate, no parade down the Himalaysian peaks, no moment when humanity can look upon its birthworld and say, "We have come home." Instead, there is only the endless march, the perpetual war, and the growing realization among the Primarchs that something fundamental is missing from their father's grand design. They do not speak of it openly, but in the quiet moments between campaigns, when bolter fire fades and the dead are counted, they feel the absence like a phantom limb. Rogel Dawn builds fortresses on worlds that will never be Terra, his hands crafting walls that protect something less than what he knows they should defend. Each battlement is perfect, each field of fire calculated to the centimeter, yet when he stands atop his creations and looks out at the stars, there is an emptiness in his chest that even duty cannot fill. He remembers fragments genetic memory, perhaps, or something the Emperor planted in his mind of yellow sunlight on ancient stone, of a palace that should exist but does not, cannot, because its foundation world is lost. He builds anyway. It is what he was made to do. But the fortresses feel hollow, temporary, inadequate measures against a threat he cannot quite articulate. Horus shines brightest in this timeline, and perhaps that is the beginning of all that follows. Without Terra to serve as the Imperium's anchor, without the Golden Throne to demand the Emperor's presence, the War Master becomes something more than a general. He is the face of the Crusade, the hand that reaches out to compliant worlds, and the fist that crushes those who resist. His victories multiply, his legend grows, and in the absence of a homeworld to venerate, the Imperial army begins to venerate him instead. Statues rise on conquered planets depicting not the Emperor in his golden armor, but Horus with his arms spread wide, the bringer of compliance, the herald of unity. The Emperor notices but says nothing, perhaps because he needs his son's charisma to hold the Imperium together, or perhaps because he is too consumed by his own search to care about the consequences of distributed loyalty. The webway project never begins. This is the detail that damns everything else that follows, though few will understand it until far too late. On Terra, in the timeline, you know, the Emperor labored in the dungeons beneath the Imperial palace, tearing at the fabric of reality to build humanity a safe highway through the Imperium, a way to travel the stars without feeding the dark gods with every jump. But here, without Terra, without access to the ancient machinery and archaeotech that sleeps beneath humanity's birthworld, the project remains theoretical, a dream sketched on data slates and whispered about in the Emperor's inner circle. The Mechanicum lacks the templates. The resources scatter across 100 forge worlds that have never been properly unified, and the Emperor himself is spread too thin, commanding fleets and directing wars when he should be bending the laws of physics to his will in a laboratory that does not exist. So humanity continues to sail the warp as it always has, desperately, dangerously, feeding the chaos gods with every voyage. The Navigators feel it first. Their third eyes, those precious mutations that allow them to perceive the currents of the Imperium, begin to see things that were not there before. Shadows move in the deep warp where no shadows should exist. Whispers echo in the spaces between stars, and the whispers have words, have promises, have names that burn the mind to hear. The Navigator houses report these phenomena to their Primarch overseers, to the admirals and commanders who rely on them. But there is no central authority to coordinate a response, no unified Terran bureaucracy to assess the threat. Each fleet responds in isolation. Some purge their navigators and promote new ones from the genetic stock. Others increase prayer sessions and devotional rituals, hoping that faith will shield their psykers from corruption. A few, in secret, begin to listen to the whispers, to record what the shadows promise. Because in the absence of the Emperor's guiding vision, even madness can sound like wisdom. The Primarchs wage their wars, and they are glorious wars, the kind that will echo in whatever histories this Imperium manages to preserve. Guilliman carves out Ultramar with the same methodical brilliance he always possessed, but without Terra to model it after, his 500 worlds become something stranger, a proto-empire within the Imperium that operates on its own logic and might one day decide it no longer needs a distant emperor's approval. The Lion hunts in the dark spaces of the galaxy, his first legion specializing in the extermination of threats that others cannot even acknowledge exist, but without the secrets locked in Terran vaults. He lacks crucial intelligence about the true nature of chaos, and some of his victories come at costs his gene seed will pay for generations hence. Vulcan builds and forges, creating wonders of technology that would make the Mechanicum weep with jealousy. But his kindness, his compassion for baseline humans, finds no reflection in Imperial policy because there is no central Imperial policy, only the disconnected doctrines of a dozen semi-autonomous crusade fleets. And the Khan rides the stellar winds, laughing as he goes, because he never cared much for the idea of a homeworld anyway. For him, the void is home enough. But even Jagatai notices that his brothers are changing, pulling apart rather than together, becoming warlords of their own domains rather than sons serving a father's dream. The Emperor's attention fractures. Without the Webway project to anchor him, without Terra's laboratories and dungeons to provide a workspace, he throws himself into the conquest with an intensity that approaches desperation. He is present at battles he should delegate to others, wielding his flaming sword on worlds that barely register as strategic priorities, because motion keeps him from having to confront the truth. He does not know how to find Terra, and every year that passes makes it less likely he ever will. The warp storms that hide humanity's birthworld grow thicker, not thinner. The gravitational anomalies multiply. It is as if the galaxy itself conspires to keep him away, or as if some intelligence vast and terrible and utterly inimical to his plans, has decided that Terra must remain hidden until the time is right for humanity's final extinction. The Custodian Guard becomes something other than what it should be. They still exist. These 10,000 golden warriors still serve as the Emperor's companions and bodyguards, but without a palace to defend, they become a mobile force, an army rather than a garrison. They fight on the front lines alongside the Primarchs, which should be glorious but instead feels like a waste, like using a master-crafted power sword to cut firewood. Their true purpose, to stand eternal vigil over the Golden Throne and by extension over humanity's future, cannot be fulfilled because there is no throne. Only the Emperor's command deck aboard whichever ship currently serves as his flagship. Some among their number begin to question, in the silence of their perfect minds, whether they were created for a function that will never be needed, whether their existence is a cosmic joke played by a fate that refuses to cooperate with their master's plans. The Mechanicum grows strange without Terra to serve as the source of orthodoxy. Mars exists, yes, and the Fabricator General still swears loyalty to the Omnissiah, still proclaims that the Emperor and the Machine God are one. But without access to the standard template constructs that sleep in Terran vaults, the tech priests begin to innovate. This should be forbidden. This violates every principle of the cult Mechanicus. But necessity overrides dogma when Forge worlds need to produce weapons and warp drives and void shields for a crusade that spans the galaxy. And if innovation is heresy, then the alternative is failure, and failure means extinction. New patterns emerge. Experimental technologies see deployment. Some work beautifully. Others malfunction in ways that suggest intelligence behind the failures. Machine spirits that have learned to hate their creators. Or perhaps something worse, chaos seeping into the code itself, corrupting the sacred algorithms that keep humanity's weapons functioning. The first major warp storm outside the Eye of Terra opens in the Segmentum Tempestus, and without Terra's resources to mount an immediate response, it swallows 17 systems before the nearest Crusade fleet can respond. Billions die screaming. The warp spills into real space like infected blood from a wound, and daemons walk on human worlds under crimson skies. The response, when it comes, is devastating but uncoordinated. 3 different Primarchs converge on the region with their legions, but they have never trained to fight together against an enemy like this, and the daemons exploit every gap in their coordination. Worlds are reconquered. The warp storm is eventually beaten back through sheer bloody-minded Imperial aggression, but the casualties are catastrophic, and worse. The Imperium has learned that such storms can appear anywhere without warning, and there is no central authority, no master plan to prevent the next one. Malcador, the Sigillite, ages faster in this timeline. He is still the Emperor's right hand, still the bearer of secrets and the coordinator of plots within plots, but without Terra's throne room to operate from. He must conduct his business aboard cramped shipboard chambers, moving from fleet to fleet, never resting, never secure. The Council of Terra that he should be organizing does not exist because there is no Terra to council over. Instead, he presides over the Council of the Crusade, a makeshift assembly of Primarchs and Generals and Fabricators that meets irregularly and agrees on almost nothing. They argue about resource allocation, about which alien empire to target next, about whether to prioritize reconquest of lost human worlds or extermination of Xenos threats. Malcador mediates, compromises, occasionally threatens, and uses every ounce of his psychic power to keep the Imperium from tearing itself apart over policy disputes. But he can feel himself burning out, using too much of his life force to hold together what should not need to be held because it should have a foundation, should have Terra as its unshakable base. The Primarchs begin to drift, not in loyalty, not yet, but in vision, in understanding of what the Imperium is supposed to become. Guilliman sees a rational state built on principles of law and efficient administration. Perturabo envisions an empire of fortresses and unbreakable defense networks. Fulgrim dreams of cultural perfection, of bringing art and beauty to the barbaric galaxy. These visions are not necessarily incompatible, but without Terra to serve as the example, without the Emperor present to mediate and direct, the Primarchs start building their own versions of the Imperium within their assigned territories. Fiefdoms emerge where there should be provinces. Personal armies grow where there should be rotating deployments. And the seeds of future conflict take root in soil that the Emperor does not notice, needs weeding because he is still searching the galaxy for coordinates that refuse to be found. The Xenos sense weakness. They should not. The Imperium is still mighty, still expanding, still crushing any who oppose it, but Xenos operate on instincts and perceptions that humanity cannot fully understand. The Orcs see an empire without a proper capital to siege and conclude that the Humies are running scared, easy pickings for a good WARG. Their attacks intensify, their warlords unify more frequently, and the green-skin tide that should be a manageable nuisance becomes a genuine threat in the galactic east, forcing multiple legions to divert from their crusade assignments to contain fungal horrors that can repopulate a world in months. The Eldar watch from their craft worlds and see something that makes them afraid in ways they have not been afraid since the fall. Because an Imperium without Terra is an Imperium without destiny. and beings who can see potential futures find that human fate has become cloudy, branching into darkness more often than not. And the darkness has names they recognize, names that once destroyed their own civilization. The Necrons wake early, not all of them, not the great majority of tomb worlds that still slumber through the ages, but some, the ones whose chronometers detect destabilization in the local stellar patterns, whose sensors register the warp storms that should not be possible according to their ancient star maps. They wake confused, disoriented, and when they assess the strategic situation, they find a galaxy that has changed beyond recognition, where the lesser races have multiplied like vermin and threaten even the silent supremacy of the Necrontier's final children. Some dynasties immediately go back to sleep, deciding that the galaxy is not yet worth their attention. Others, hungrier or more paranoid, begin preliminary scouting operations, testing human defenses, and finding them strong but not as unified as the strategic calculus suggests they should be. The Necrons are patient. They have waited 60 million years. They can wait longer. But now they know. Humanity is not the unstoppable force it could have been, and when the real awakening comes, the harvest will be easier than the ancient protocols predicted. The mutation spreads unchecked through baseline human populations. This is the consequence few anticipated but everyone should have foreseen. On Terra, in the proper timeline, the Emperor's presence and the webway project's construction created a psychic dead zone, a place where the warp's influence was minimal and genetic stability could be maintained through careful monitoring. Without Terra, without that anchor point of stability, human populations across the Imperium are exposed to higher levels of warp radiation, and the human genome, always more flexible than it should be, begins to express that flexibility in horrifying ways. The number of psychers increases exponentially. The number of failed psychers, those whose powers manifest as tumors or tentacles or spontaneous combustion, increases even faster. And the number of true mutants, humans whose DNA has been rewritten by exposure to the warp's fundamental chaos, becomes a crisis that the Imperium lacks the infrastructure to address. Purges become routine. Every world conducts them on irregular schedules, killing thousands or millions of their own citizens to root out the tainted, the changed, the damned. But the purges are never thorough enough, because there is no unified doctrine defining what counts as mutation worthy of death versus acceptable human variation. One world might execute citizens for having the wrong number of fingers. Another might tolerate minor psychic abilities as useful tools. The inconsistency breeds resentment, breeds underground resistance movements, breeds secret cults of the damned who figure that if they are going to be hunted anyway, they might as well embrace the powers that the Imperium fears. Chaos finds these cults effortlessly. The dark gods whisper promises of acceptance, of transformation, of revenge against the Imperium that wants them dead and lacking any strong ideological counterweight, lacking the imperial creed that will one day sanctify the Emperor as divine. Many of the mutants and psychers listen. The first chaos cults are crude affairs, isolated warbands and covens that worship half-understood entities and practice rituals plagiarized from Xenos traditions or invented wholesale through trial and error. Most are put down quickly by local military forces or visiting legions. But some succeed in opening warp rifts, in summoning daemons, in spreading corruption beyond their founding worlds. And each success teaches the dark gods more about how to manipulate this timeline's Imperium, how to exploit the gaps in its defenses. Khorne finds warriors easy to corrupt in a crusade that has lasted centuries without clear ultimate victory. Nurgle slips his influence into overcrowded hive cities where disease and despair are already endemic. Tzientch weaves his schemes through the Mechanicum's experimental research programs, encouraging innovation that leads to damnation. And Slaanesh, still young, still hungry, finds willing servants among those who seek perfection or pleasure, or any experience that breaks the monotony of life in an Imperium that demands everything and promises nothing but survival. The Emperor knows. He must know. His psychic awareness spans the galaxy, and there is no secret so dark that it can hide from his sight when he chooses to look. But he does not intervene the way he should. does not take personal command of the anti-chaos operations, does not divert his attention from the search for Terra long enough to systematically root out every cult and daemon-touched Legion soldier. This is his great failing in this timeline, the moment when his obsession with the lost homeworld blinds him to the cancer growing in the Imperium's body. Later, when the full consequences become clear, historians who survive will argue about whether he could have prevented what came next, whether any being, even one as powerful as the master of mankind, could have fought on so many fronts simultaneously. But the truth, the cold and terrible truth, is that he made a choice, consciously or not, to prioritize the search for Terra over the purification of his empire, and that choice will cost humanity everything it might have been. Erebus arrives at this moment like a knife between ribs. He is not yet the architect of the heresy that you know, but he is patient, intelligent, and utterly devoted to the Ruinous Powers, and he recognizes the opportunity that this timeline presents. Without Terra to serve as the Imperium's spiritual center, without the developing Imperial cult to provide ideological cohesion, the space exists for alternative philosophies, alternative loyalties, alternative truths. He begins his work carefully, recruiting from among the Astartes who feel disenfranchised by the endless crusade, who wonder why they fight and die for an emperor who seems more interested in finding one lost world than in securing the thousands they have already conquered. His arguments are subtle at first, questions rather than statements, doubts rather than heresies. Why does the emperor hide his true nature? What is so important about Terra that its absence consumes his every thought? Could it be that he fears something on that world, some secret or rival that would unmask his pretensions to divinity? The seeds find fertile ground in Lorgar's heart. The word-bearer Primarch has always sought meaning, always needed to believe in something greater than himself, and in this timeline, his faith has nowhere to anchor. The Emperor has forbidden worship of him as a god, but has offered no alternative object of veneration that satisfies Lorgar's spiritual hunger. So when Erebus, his trusted first chaplain, begins to whisper of older powers, of gods who desire worship and offer tangible blessings in return, Lorgar listens. He resists at first. His loyalty to the Emperor is genuine, profound, but the whispers persist, and without Terra's hypothetical imperial truth to counter them with institutional weight, they begin to sound less like heresy and more like forbidden wisdom that someone needs to speak aloud. The pilgrimage to Cadia happens earlier in this timeline, before the Great Crusade is even half complete. Lorgar takes his entire legion off the board for reasons he refuses to explain to his brothers or the Emperor, claiming only that they must seek enlightenment, must understand truths that the Imperium has overlooked. The Emperor lets him go, perhaps because he is distracted, perhaps because he believes Lorgar will learn his lesson and return chastened. It is one of the worst mistakes in a timeline full of mistakes. On Cadia, beneath the shadow of the Eye of Terror, Lorgar finds what Erebus has prepared for him: temples to the dark gods, rituals of unspeakable power, and a revelation that breaks something fundamental in his soul. The Emperor is not the only god in the galaxy. He is not even the strongest. And the beings who rule the warp care nothing for his plans, his dreams, his vision of an enlightened humanity. They desire only worship, sacrifice, and the eventual consumption of every soul in the materium. Lorgar returns changed. His eyes hold a light that was not there before, a fervor that makes even his own legionnaires uneasy. He begins to preach again, but now his sermons have a different tenor, speak of different powers. And though he is careful never to openly contradict the Emperor, the subtext of his words carries poison. Other Primarchs notice but do not understand the depth of his transformation. Guilliman dismisses it as more of Lorgar's religious nonsense. Horus finds it concerning but not urgent enough to interrupt his campaign schedule. Only Magnus, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, senses the warp taint on his brother and confronts him in private, and what happens in that confrontation remains unknown because neither speaks of it afterward. But Magnus emerges looking shaken, and Lorgar emerges looking triumphant. The breaking point comes at a war council that should have been routine. The assembled Primarchs, 8 of them, a rare gathering given how spread out the crusade has become meet to discuss the allocation of Forge World output for the next decade's campaigns. Tensions are already high because resources are stretched thin, because every legion wants priority for its operations, because without Terra to serve as neutral ground, the meeting takes place aboard Horus's flagship, giving him home field advantage. The discussion devolves into argument, argument into accusation, and accusation into something worse when Lorgar stands and speaks words that cannot be unspoken. He calls the Emperor a tyrant, a liar who has built his empire on false promises and hidden his true nature behind psychic manipulation. He says that the search for Terra is a distraction, that perhaps Terra does not want to be found, that the Emperor fears what judgment might await him there. And most damning, most unforgivable, he suggests that there are other powers worthy of humanity's devotion, older and stronger than the Emperor could ever be. The chamber erupts. Guilliman demands Lorgar's immediate arrest. Dawn reaches for his sidearm, but Horus raises his hand and, to everyone's shock, calls for calm, for rational discussion, because, perhaps, he says, perhaps Lorgar has a point worth considering. Not about worshipping other gods, Horus is careful to distance himself from that suggestion, but about the Emperor's priorities, about whether the Imperium is being led or merely managed, whether they fight for a vision or just to keep fighting. The other Primarchs stare at the War Master, and in that moment, several futures collapse into probability. Some will later claim they saw it then, saw the fracture lines that would split the Imperium in half. Others will insist it was more gradual, that Horus remained loyal long after that meeting. But the truth is that seeds were planted in that chamber, doubts about the Emperor's judgment, questions about who really deserved their loyalty. The Emperor remains absent from this council, of course, because he is 500 light-years away investigating a lead on Terra's location that will ultimately prove false. When news of the confrontation reaches him, he returns with a fleet, but the damage is already done. He summons Lorgar to his flagship, and what happens in that private audience is never recorded. But Lorgar emerges alive, unpunished, with his legion intact, and permission to continue the crusade. This leniency baffles those who witness it. The Emperor has destroyed worlds for lesser heresies. He has purged entire populations for speaking against unity. Yet his own son speaks of betrayal and walks away without consequence. Perhaps he believes he can still save Lorgar, still turn him back from the precipice. Perhaps he is so distracted by his search that he cannot spare the attention for a domestic crisis. Or perhaps, and this is the darkest possibility, he needs Lorgar, needs every Primarch, because without Terra to serve as the Imperium's recruiting and production base, he cannot afford to lose even one of his generals. The Thousand Sons discover something terrible in the ruins of a Xeno civilization in the galactic southwest, a data repository that contains fragmentary information about the warp and the entities that dwell there. Magnus should destroy this information immediately. He knows the danger, knows that some knowledge corrupts merely through exposure. But Magnus is a scholar as well as a warrior, and the temptation to understand, to learn, to master the very forces that threaten humanity proves too strong. He studies the Xenos data in secret, shares it with his inner circle of librarians, and begins to experiment with techniques that the Emperor has specifically forbidden. His intentions are pure. He believes that by understanding chaos, he can develop better defenses against it, can make his legion the ultimate weapon against demonic incursion. But the road to damnation is paved with good intentions, and the Thousand Sons walk it with eyes wide open, convinced that their psychic discipline and brotherhood will protect them from corruption. They are wrong. Mutations begin to appear in the Thousand Sons ranks, not the crude physical alterations that afflict baseline humans, but subtle changes to the gene seed, psychic tumors that grow in the spaces between thoughts, alterations to perception that make the warp seem friendlier, more cooperative than it truly is. Magnus notices but believes he can control it, believes that by pushing forward with his research, he will find the understanding necessary to reverse the damage. He does not understand that he has already been caught in Scientia's web, that every step he takes toward enlightenment is a step deeper into the labyrinth, and there is no center to reach, no final truth to discover, only endless change and the gradual dissolution of everything he sought to protect. The Webway project, in this timeline, never progresses beyond theoretical sketches and preliminary materials testing. Without Terra, without the Emperor's full attention, without access to the archaeotech that might have made it possible, the dream of giving, humanity, a safe passage through the stars, remains just that, a dream. Some among the Mechanicum continue to research the underlying principles, but their work is classified, scattered across multiple Forge worlds, and vulnerable to infiltration by agents who serve interests other than the Omnissiah. Chaos gets into the research. Not obviously, not all at once, but incrementally, through corrupted data uploads, through tech priests who have been turned by whispered promises of forbidden knowledge, through machine spirits that have been infected with daemonic code. The result is that when prototype Webway gates are finally constructed and tested, they do not lead to the clean, daemon-free tunnels of Eldar design. They open directly into the warp, unstable and screaming, and the first test kills everyone within a kilometer radius when daemons pour through and have to be purged with orbital bombardment. After that failure, the project is quietly shelved. The Mechanicum claims they need more time, more research, more resources. The Emperor does not push the issue because he has other priorities, because Terra still eludes him, and without it, the Webway is just one more impossible dream. So humanity continues to navigate the warp the old way, blind and desperate, feeding the Chaos Gods with every journey, giving the daemons more and more power to manifest in real space, setting up a feedback loop that will eventually make warp travel impossible and cut every human world off from every other, isolating them to be conquered and consumed one by one. The Eldar craft world Ulthway makes contact with the Imperium through intermediaries, neutral Xenos merchants who arrange a meeting between a Farseer and a delegation of Imperial diplomats. The Eldar offer a warning. The warp is changing, growing more violent, and humanity's uncontrolled expansion is accelerating the process. They offer knowledge, potentially even alliance, if the Imperium will agree to certain restrictions on its use of psychers and its incursions into what the Eldar consider sacred space. It is a remarkable offer, unprecedented in the history of Imperial-Xenos relations, and it dies in the first hour of negotiation when the Imperial delegates realize that the Eldar are asking humanity to voluntarily limit its own development to avoid disturbing the warp. To human ears, this sounds like a trick, an attempt to handicap humanity while the Xenos preserve their own advantages. The delegation rejects the offer with barely concealed hostility, and when the Eldar press their case, insisting that the future they have seen shows human extinction if these courses are not changed, the Imperials take it as a threat. The Eldar withdraw, saddened but not surprised. They have seen this outcome in their runes, have known that the Mon-K would refuse wisdom and choose damnation instead. They return to their craft worlds and begin preparing for a galaxy where humanity is no longer a potential ally, but merely another doomed race stumbling toward the eye of Terra's embrace. Some among them advocate for intervention, for using Ulthway's remaining military might to cripple the Imperium before it grows too dangerous. But cooler heads prevail, pointing out that humanity is already well advanced on the path to self-destruction and needs no help from the Eldar to complete the journey. Better to conserve their strength for the battles to come, for the defense of the craft worlds when the warp finally consumes the materium and the long dying of the universe enters its terminal phase. The Great Crusade reaches its 200th year, and momentum begins to falter. Not in battle, the legions are still victorious more often than not, but in purpose, in the shared vision that should drive them forward. The Primarchs rule their territories more like kings than generals, and their territories no longer feel like provinces of a unified imperium, but like independent kingdoms that happen to in kings that acknowledge the same distant emperor. Trade and communication between these kingdoms remain strong, but the cultural divergence is becoming pronounced. Ultramar speaks of rational governance and legal frameworks. The territories under the Khan's supervision embrace a nomadic aesthetic and distrust of centralized authority. The worlds conquered by the Iron Hands are places of relentless industry and cybernetic enhancement, while those under Vulcan's protection retain more of their human character at the cost of military efficiency. These differences are not yet in conflict, but the potential for future division grows with every year that passes without Terra to model a unified culture. Horus stands at the center of this web, and he alone seems capable of holding it together. The other Primarchs respect him, defer to him, and when disputes arise, they accept his mediation. He is everything the Emperor is not in this timeline: present, attentive, focused on the immediate problems of governance and military coordination, rather than chasing ghosts across the galaxy. The Imperial army, the mortal forces that fight alongside the legions, begin to worship Horus not as a god, but as the functional leader of the Imperium, the man who actually makes decisions while the Emperor searches for something he will never find. This shift in loyalty does not happen all at once, and is not yet a betrayal. Horus remains loyal to his father, insists on it in public and private. But the foundation is being laid for a future where Horus might be asked to choose between loyalty to the Emperor and loyalty to the Imperium, and no one can predict which he will choose. The mutation problem reaches crisis levels in the Segmentum Solar, or what would be the Segmentum Solar if Terra could be found to serve as its center. Instead, it is just a region of densely populated space where billions of humans live in close proximity, and warp exposure is statistically higher than in less crowded sectors. Reports flood in from planetary governors and military commanders. Entire hive levels gone mad overnight, their populations transformed into mobs of mutants and cultists. Naval vessels suffering catastrophic failures when their navigators undergo spontaneous psychic transformations. Agricultural worlds reporting crop blights that seem to possess malicious intelligence, fungal infections that spell out words in High Gothic when viewed from orbit. The Imperium responds with the only solution it knows: overwhelming military force. Legions are pulled from crusade duties to conduct extermination operations in their own territory. Billions die in the purges, and billions more die in the famines and economic collapses that follow when entire worlds' industrial capacity is reduced to ash. The Emperor finally acknowledges the crisis and convenes a great council aboard the flagship he is currently using as a mobile capital. All 20 Primarchs are summoned, along with representatives from the Mechanicum, the Imperial army, the Navigator houses, and the nascent Administratum that is attempting to coordinate governance across the Imperium's vast territories. The meeting lasts for weeks, and the debates are fierce. Guilliman proposes a centralized anti-mutation bureau with authority to override local governments. The Khan argues for empowering individual worlds to handle their own problems with minimal interference. Magnus advocates for training more sanctioned psychers to counter the unsanctioned ones, a position that most of the others reject as insanity. Mortarion, whose hatred of psychers borders on pathological, demands a complete ban on all psychic practice, including the Navigators, which would make warp travel impossible and end the Great Crusade. The Emperor makes his ruling, a compromise that satisfies no one. Psychers are to be carefully controlled, but not banned. Worlds are to conduct regular purges, but according to centralized guidelines that the Administratum will draft and distribute. The Mechanicum is to research technological solutions to warp exposure. The legions are to increase their counterinsurgency operations in high-risk sectors. It is a reasonable response to an impossible problem, and it fails almost immediately because there is no enforcement mechanism, no central authority with the power to ensure compliance. Each Primarch interprets the ruling in his own way. Each world applies it according to local custom, and the mutation crisis continues to spiral because the Imperium is treating symptoms rather than the underlying disease, which is that humanity is psychically evolving faster than its culture and technology can adapt. And without Terra to anchor development, without the Golden Throne to serve as a psychic lighthouse, there is no stable reference point around which human evolution can coalesce. The whispers in the warp grow louder. Navigators report it, astropaths confirm it, and even baseline humans who have never touched the warp in their lives begin to experience dreams, visions, moments of impossible knowledge that fade upon waking but leave behind a residue of wrongness. The Chaos Gods are strengthening, not because they have more worshippers, though that is also true, but because the structure of reality itself is becoming more permeable. The barriers between materium and immaterium thinning everywhere instead of just in the eye of Terra. This should not be possible according to any model of physics or metaphysics that the Imperium understands. But it is happening anyway, and the scholars who study such things begin to whisper a terrible hypothesis, that Terra's absence is not a coincidence, that perhaps Terra is the linchpin holding reality stable, and by remaining lost, by refusing to be found, it is allowing the warp to bleed through everywhere else, turning the entire galaxy into what the Eye of Terra represents, a place where the laws of physics bow to the will of nightmare gods. The Emperor hears these theories and does not dismiss them. This is telling. He does not confirm them either, but those close enough to observe his reactions note a tension in his jaw, a flicker in his golden eyes, that suggests he has considered the possibility and found it plausible. If true, it means his search for Terra is not personal obsession but strategic necessity, that finding humanity's birthworld is not about sentiment, but about preventing the complete dissolution of reality. But he does not share this reasoning with his sons, with his generals, with anyone who might help coordinate a more effective search. Perhaps he fears that speaking the theory aloud will make it more real. Perhaps he does not trust anyone else with knowledge that could breed despair. Or perhaps he is simply too proud to admit that he does not fully understand what is happening, that the master of mankind, who walked among humanity's earliest empires and shaped the course of history for 40,000 years, has finally encountered a problem whose solution eludes even his vast intellect. Fulgrim descends into obsession of a different kind. The Primarch of the Emperor's children has always pursued perfection, but without Terra to define what perfection means in an imperial context, his standards become increasingly personal, increasingly divorced from utility. His legion begins to modify its tactics not for efficiency, but for aesthetic beauty, conducting battles that are works of art rather than military operations. They win, mostly, because they are still Astartes, still possessed of transhuman abilities and weapons that can crack planets, but the casualties they take start to rise as Fulgrim prioritizes style over substance. His brothers notice and attempt interventions, but Fulgrim receives criticism as if it were confirmation that others simply cannot appreciate what he is trying to achieve, and he withdraws further into his own vision, taking his legion with him into territories where they encounter a Xenos artifact that should have been destroyed on sight, a blade that whispers promises of artistic transcendence, and Fulgrim, who has been primed by years of isolation and obsession, picks it up and condemns himself and his entire legion to a fate worse than anything the Imperium's enemies could have inflicted. The daemon in the blade works slowly, carefully, because it understands that Fulgrim is valuable, that his corruption must be subtle enough to avoid detection until it is far too late. It does not offer him chaos directly. Instead, it offers him what he already wants: perfection, beauty, the ability to transcend the limitations of his physical form and create art that will echo through eternity. Fulgrim accepts these gifts without understanding their source, without recognizing that every enhancement, every expansion of his senses, every moment of transcendent experience is paid for with a piece of his soul. By the time he realizes what he has become, he will be too far gone to care, and the Emperor's children will follow him into damnation because they have tied their identity so completely to their Primarch's vision that they cannot conceive of questioning it. Perturabo breaks in a different way. The master of siege warfare, the architect of fortresses that have never fallen, slowly comes to understand that in a galaxy without Terra, there is nothing worth defending. Every fortress he builds protects something temporary, some waypoint in an endless crusade that has no final destination. He continues his work because duty demands it, because he was built to wage war and knows nothing else. But the joy, if he ever felt such an emotion, has long since drained away, leaving only bitter competence. His iron warriors become machines like him, efficient and joyless, conducting sieges with mathematical precision and taking casualties without complaint, because casualties are just another resource to be calculated and spent. Other legions begin to avoid working with the iron warriors, not because they are ineffective, but because their presence is demoralizing, because spending time around Perturabo and his sons makes you feel the futility of the entire enterprise, makes you question why you are fighting when every victory just leads to another battlefield. The breaking point for Perturabo comes during a siege that should be routine, another Xenos fortress in another forgettable system. His iron warriors perform flawlessly, reducing the defenses with textbook precision, and when the fortress falls, Perturabo stands in the ruins and realizes he feels nothing. No satisfaction, no pride, not even relief that it is over. Just emptiness, and the knowledge that another siege awaits on another world, and then another, and another, forever. Because the crusade never ends, and there is no Terra to return to when it finally does. He orders his legion to withdraw, leaves the conquered world, without consolidating Imperial control, and for 3 months he disappears from all contact, taking his fleet into the deep void where even astropathic communication cannot reach. When he returns, he is changed. His efficiency has been replaced with something closer to spite, a determination to prove that if the Imperium wants fortresses, he will give them fortresses. The most brutal, the most excessive, the most unnecessary fortifications in the galaxy, monuments to wasted effort that will stand for millennia as testaments to his contempt. The Night Haunter's madness deepens without Terra's justice system to provide context for his methods. Conrad Curze has always been brutal, has always employed terror as a weapon, but in the proper timeline, his excesses are at least theoretically in service of Imperial law, a dark mirror of the justice that Terra claims to represent. In this timeline, without Terra, without any central legal framework, Curze's tactics become increasingly unmoored from any principle beyond his own traumatic visions. His Night Lords begin to conduct compliance operations that are indistinguishable from atrocities, skinning entire populations, and arranging the remains as warnings to other worlds, broadcasting picked feeds of tortures so elaborate they serve no strategic purpose beyond Curze's need to manifest the violence he sees in his precognitive dreams. The Emperor orders him to cease, but Curze argues that his methods work, that worlds that witness the Night Lord's brutality surrender without firing a shot. And is that not the point of the Great Crusade, to bring compliance efficiently? The Emperor cannot refute the logic without establishing moral guidelines that do not exist in this timeline, without Terra's philosophy and law to define acceptable versus unacceptable conquest. And so Curze continues, and his legion descends deeper into a darkness that will eventually consume them completely. The rift between Magnus and his brother, Primarchs, widens as the Thousand Suns mutations become impossible to hide. During a joint operation with the Space Wolves, Leman Russ confronts Magnus about the physical changes in his legionnaires, the altered eyes and skin tones and occasional spontaneous manifestation of psychic phenomena that violate the Emperor's edicts about sorcery. Magnus defends his sons, claims that they are simply more evolved, more in tune with humanity's psychic potential, and that the mutations are cosmetic, harmless, a natural expression of the Thousand Suns' genetic heritage. Russ does not believe him, can smell the wrongness on the Thousand Suns with the enhanced senses of Fenris's predators, and the confrontation nearly comes to blows before other Primarchs intervene. The incident is reported to the Emperor, who summons Magnus for a private audience that lasts 3 days, and ends with Magnus's recall to whatever world is currently serving as the Emperor's headquarters, a punishment disguised as reassignment, a chance for Magnus to prove his loyalty by halting his experiments and purging any corruption from his legion. Magnus agrees to the terms but has no intention of keeping them. He believes he is too close to a breakthrough, too near to understanding the fundamental principles that would allow humanity to master the warp rather than fear it. He continues his research in secret, shares it with an inner circle of trusted librarians, and when the mutations accelerate rather than stabilize, he interprets it as a sign that they are pushing through to the other side, that enlightenment is just one more step away. He does not see the trap closing around him, does not recognize that Siench has been guiding his research all along, ensuring that each discovery leads him deeper into dependency on warpcraft, that each technique he masters makes him less able to function without it. By the time Magnus understands what has happened, his legion will be damned beyond redemption, and he will have only two choices: accept damnation and become what the Emperor most feared, or refuse it and watch his sons die slowly from the mutations he can no longer control. The first open rebellion occurs not in a legion but in a sector fleet, when an admiral who has spent 30 years fighting the Great Crusade without ever seeing the Emperor, without ever understanding why they are fighting, decides that his fleet has earned the right to stop. He declares independence, claims a cluster of systems as his own sovereign territory, and invites other Imperial forces who are tired of the endless war to join him. The response is immediate and overwhelming. 3 legions converge on the rebel sector, and the suppression is so brutal that it makes the Night Haunter's work look restrained by comparison. The admiral and every officer who supported him are executed, their bodies launched into the nearest star. Every world that sided with the rebellion is subjected to decimation, 1 in 10 of the population randomly selected and killed as an example. And in a move that shocks even the legions conducting it, the Emperor orders that all records of the rebellion be expunged, that history must never show that Imperial forces turned against the Imperium, because even the knowledge that rebellion is possible might encourage others. But you cannot kill information in a galaxy this large, and word of the suppression spreads through the Imperial forces like a disease. It breeds fear, yes, but also resentment, because many of the soldiers and sailors and Astartes who hear the story sympathize with the Admiral's position, even if they would never act on that sympathy. They too are tired. They too have been fighting longer than any war in human history, and they too wonder what it is all for, why they cannot claim the spoils of their victories and build something stable rather than forever pushing the borders of an empire that has no center. The discontent does not manifest as more rebellions, not yet, but it festers, creates a substrate of dissatisfaction that chaos will exploit when the time comes. Because soldiers who fight without belief are soldiers who are vulnerable to anyone who can offer them a reason to believe again, even if that reason is damnation. The Rangdan genocides still occur, but they are worse in this timeline, far worse, because the Imperium's response is uncoordinated, and the Xenos have more time to spread their infection before Imperial forces can mount an effective counteroffensive. The Rangdan are a threat that the Imperium of the proper timeline barely survived, a Xenos species that nearly broke the Great Crusade and required the sacrifice of entire legions to contain. In this timeline, without Terra to coordinate the response, without the Emperor's full attention because he is off searching for coordinates that continue to elude him, the initial Rangdan incursions are misidentified as minor Xenos raids, and by the time the Imperium realizes what it faces, the Rangdan have established a foothold in 3 sectors and are spreading their neural parasites through human populations faster than they can be purged. The Dark Angels and the Space Wolves bear the brunt of the fighting, and they nearly break under the weight of it. The Lion pushes his legion to the edge of destruction, conducting boarding actions against Rangdan bioships with casualty rates that would make even Perturabo blanch. The Space Wolves lose entire great companies to the neural parasites, watch their brothers transformed into Rangdan puppets, and have to put them down with bolt and blade. And the psychological damage of killing their own corrupted brothers scars the Legion in ways that will never fully heal. When the Xenocides finally end after 15 years of continuous warfare, 2 legions have been reduced to shadows of their former strength, and the Imperium has lost control of 12 systems that have to be permanently quarantined, because the Rangdan corruption cannot be fully purged from the environment. The cost becomes a secret that the Imperium keeps from its own citizens, another piece of information expunged from official records, but the legions know, and they understand what the silence means. It means they cannot be allowed to fail because there is no margin for failure, no reserve strength to draw on if they falter, no Terra with its inexhaustible reserves of soldiers and materiel to replace their losses. They are all the Imperium has, and if they fall, humanity falls with them. This knowledge creates a pride that borders on arrogance in some legions, a sense that they are indispensable, that their primarchs and generals can make demands of the Emperor because he needs them more than they need him. It creates bitterness in others, resentment that they are being spent like ammunition in a war with no end. that their sacrifices are noted and then forgotten because there is always another crisis, another threat, another battle. Lorgar makes his second pilgrimage, this time to the Eye of Terror itself, and he takes a company of word-bearers with him, along with elements of the Mechanicum who have been corrupted by his preaching and seek knowledge that cannot be found in Imperial databases. They venture to the edge of the Great Warp Storm, to worlds where reality is thin and daemons walk openly under alien skies, and there they make contact with something that calls itself a power, an entity that offers truth in exchange for worship. Lorgar accepts. He kneels before altars carved from human bone, speaks prayers in languages that existed before human language, and when he rises, he is a priest of chaos in all but name, a servant of the dark gods who still wears the insignia of the Imperium because his mission is not yet complete. He returns from his pilgrimage transformed, radiating a charisma that did not exist before, speaking with a conviction that compels even those who despise him to listen. He begins to preach not just within his legion but to other legions, visiting their flagships, attending their war councils, and everywhere he goes, he plants seeds of doubt about the Emperor, questions about why they serve, suggestions that perhaps there are other paths, older truths, forgotten gods who might reward their faithful with something more than endless war. Some reject him outright. Dawn finds him contemptible. Guilliman has him banned from Ultramar space, but others listen. And among those who listen are Primarchs whose names will become synonymous with damnation in the centuries to come. The Emperor confronts Lorgar one final time, and this meeting, unlike the previous one, ends in violence. The details are never recorded, but witnesses report that Lorgar emerged from the Emperor's chambers with burn marks on his armor and a look in his eyes that suggested he had seen his own death and no longer feared it. The word-bearers are censured, their honor questioned, their banners stripped of commendations earned over 2 centuries of crusade, and Lorgar is ordered to recant his preaching or face execution. He appears to comply. He makes public statements of loyalty, submits his legion to inspections by the custodian guard, and for 5 years he is a model son, quiet and obedient and seemingly chastened. But in secret, he is building something, a network of believers that spans multiple legions, that includes corrupted remembrances and Mechanicum adepts, and even a few rogue members of the Imperial army command structure. He is preparing for the moment when the Imperium will tear itself apart, and when that moment comes, he intends to stand on the side of the gods who promised him that devotion would be rewarded, who offered him meaning in a universe that the Emperor insists is meaningless. The Cabal makes contact with the Imperium through intermediaries, Xenos of various species who claim to represent an ancient organization dedicated to combating chaos. They offer intelligence about the Dark God's plans, about warp storms that are forming in regions the Imperium considers secure, about corrupted elements within the Imperial forces themselves. They ask only for a meeting with the Emperor, a chance to present their evidence and coordinate humanity's response with the Cabal's own operations. The offer is rejected out of hand by Imperial diplomats who see it as a Xenos trick, an attempt to sow discord and paranoia within Imperial ranks. The Cabal withdraws, and with them goes the last chance this timeline's Imperium has to receive warning about the true scope of what is coming, about the heresy that is building in the shadows of the Great Crusade. Alpharius and Omegon, the twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion, do meet with the Cabal in secret, without the Emperor's knowledge or permission. What transpires in that meeting remains one of the great mysteries of this timeline, but afterward, the Alpha Legion begins to change, becoming more secretive, more willing to employ tactics that other legions consider dishonorable, more focused on long-term strategic objectives that they refuse to explain to their brother legions. Some speculate that the twins have been corrupted, that they serve chaos now under a cover of loyalty. Others believe they remain true to the Imperium, but have adopted a utilitarian philosophy that allows them to work with Xenos, to employ forbidden tactics, to sacrifice honor in pursuit of ultimate victory. The truth is probably more complex than either theory, involving calculations about possible futures and acceptable costs that even other Primarchs would find difficult to understand or accept. The webway project's final failure comes when a research station attempting to create a stable warp gate suffers a catastrophic breach. Daemons pour through the experimental portal in numbers that should not be possible, and before the station can be destroyed, they spread to 3 nearby worlds, turning them into demon worlds in real space, permanent breaches in reality that will never heal. The Imperium responds with overwhelming force, conducts exterminatus on all 3 worlds, but the implications are devastating. It means that even attempting to build a webway is dangerous enough to potentially destroy the Imperium from within. The project is permanently cancelled, all research materials are ordered destroyed, and the tech priests who worked on it are mind-wiped or executed to prevent contamination. Humanity's last hope of traveling the stars without feeding, chaos dies in fire and madness, and no one outside the Emperor's inner circle even understands what has been lost. The Emperor's search for Terra reaches its 250th year, and for the first time, there are open suggestions from some of his generals and administrators that he should abandon it, that the resources being spent on exploration fleets and astropathic surveys could be better used elsewhere. The Emperor refuses to even consider it, and his refusal is so absolute, so final, that no one dares raise the issue again. But the thought has been voiced, and thoughts, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. They linger in the minds of those who heard them, and they breed further questions. What is on Terra that the Emperor needs so badly? Why can't the Imperium function without it? Is it possible that Terra is not lost but hiding, that something on humanity's birthworld is preventing it from being found? And if so, what does that say about the Emperor's judgment, his power, his claim to be humanity's rightful ruler? Horus begins to assemble what he calls a Stability Council, a permanent body of primarchs and senior commanders who will coordinate Imperial policy in the Emperor's absence. The stated purpose is to improve efficiency, to ensure that crusade operations are synchronized and resources allocated rationally. The unstated purpose is to create a parallel power structure that can function without the Emperor's direct input, that can make decisions and enforce them across the Imperium, even when the master of mankind is incommunicado, pursuing leads in deep space, or investigating warp phenomena too dangerous for normal communications. Most of the primarchs support the idea. Even those who are suspicious of Horus's motives recognize that something needs to change, that the Imperium's current structure is unsustainable. Only a few, like Dawn and Gilliman, understand the danger that by creating this council, Horus is building the infrastructure for a regime that could function without the Emperor, and from there, it is only a small step to asking why the Emperor is necessary at all. The first major warp storm since the Eye of Terror opens in the galactic southeast, and it is massive, swallowing 14 systems before its expansion stabilizes. Billions die in the initial manifestation as warp energy floods into real space and transforms planets into nightmares of impossible geometry and living horror. The Imperium's response is hampered by conflicting orders and jurisdictional disputes. 3 different primarchs claim authority over the region, and each wants to handle the crisis differently. By the time they agree on a coordinated strategy, the storm has stabilized, and the systems it consumed are permanently lost, turned into a second Eye of Terror that will plague the Imperium for the rest of its existence. The incident proves what many have feared but few have been willing to say aloud. Without Terra, without a central coordinating authority, the Imperium is structurally incapable of responding effectively to galaxy-scale threats. Horus uses this failure to advance his argument for the Stability Council, and this time, even his most cautious brothers agree that something must be done. The council is formally established with representatives from all 20 legions, the Mechanicum, the Imperial Army, and the major navigator houses. Its first act is to establish protocols for responding to warp storm manifestations, including provisions for automatically elevating the nearest Primarch to supreme command in affected regions. Its second act is to begin drafting something that looks uncomfortably like a constitution, a formal document that will define the powers and limitations of Imperial institutions in a way that the Emperor's word has never required definition before. This is the moment when the Imperium begins to institutionalize, to become less a personal empire ruled by a transhuman demigod and more a bureaucratic state with procedures and precedents. In the long term, this might save humanity, might create structures robust enough to survive even the Emperor's death. In the short term, it is the final betrayal, the act that makes explicit what has been implicit for decades, that the Imperium no longer fully trusts the Emperor's judgment and is building mechanisms to function without him. The Emperor returns to discover what Horus has done, and the confrontation between father and son is epic in scope if not in duration. They meet alone, no witnesses, no records, and when they emerge, neither speaks of what was said. But the Stability Council continues to function, which suggests either that the Emperor approved it or that he recognized he lacks the political capital to disband it without risking open rebellion among his sons. The Council begins to make decisions, issuing directives that supersede individual Primarchs' authority, coordinating resources across legion boundaries, and slowly, inexorably, assuming functions that the Emperor himself used to perform. The Imperium is transforming from autocracy to something else, something that does not yet have a name but feels to those who study history like the beginning of an Imperial Senate. And if you squint, you can see the outlines of the Senatorum Imperialis that will exist in some dark futures, governing humanity without the Emperor's input, because the Emperor is indisposed, locked in an eternal psychic battle to keep the warp from consuming Terra. Except in this timeline, there is no Terra to protect. So what is the Emperor fighting for? This is the question that breaks Mortarion. The Death Lord has always been suspicious of psychers, of the warp, of anything that smacks of sorcery or manipulation, but he has followed the Emperor because he believed his father understood the threat and was fighting to protect humanity from it. But as the warp storms multiply, as mutations spread and chaos cults proliferate despite the Imperium's best efforts, Mortarion begins to suspect that the Emperor has no plan, no solution, that humanity is doomed to be consumed by the warp's horrors, regardless of how hard they fight. And if that is true, if extinction is inevitable, then why continue suffering? Why not embrace what cannot be defeated, make peace with the powers that will eventually consume everyone, perhaps earn a comfortable position in the new order rather than dying in futile resistance? These thoughts are poison, and Mortarion knows it, but he cannot stop thinking them. And when a voice in the warp begins to whisper that it understands, that it has seen civilizations die before and knows how to grant mercy to those wise enough to accept it, Mortarion listens. He does not surrender to chaos, not yet, but the foundation is laid, the weakness identified, and Nurgle is patient, has always been patient, can wait centuries for a single soul if that soul is valuable enough. The Night of the Wolf occurs in this timeline as well, but its outcome is different. Russ confronts Magnus about the growing mutations in the Thousand Suns, demands that Magnus submit his legion to examination by the Space Wolves' rune priests to verify that no demonic taint has taken root. Magnus refuses, argues that the Space Wolves' rune priests are themselves psychers, making Russ a hypocrite who condemns in others what he tolerates in himself. The argument escalates to violence, and the two legions clash on a barren moon in a battle that should never have happened. The wolves fight with savage fury, but the Thousand Suns wield powers that Fenris's warriors cannot match, and when the dust settles, the Space Wolves have taken catastrophic casualties, and Russ himself lies broken, his body healing but his pride shattered, his understanding of his place in the Imperium forever altered. Magnus withdraws his legion without following through on the kill, but the damage is done. The Thousand Suns have proven they can defeat another legion in open combat, which means they have become too powerful, too dangerous, and every other legion now looks at them with fear and hatred, isolating Magnus further, pushing him deeper into the embrace of the warp entities that promise they can protect his sons from the persecution that will surely come. The Emperor arrives too late to prevent battle but in time to assess the damage, and his fury is terrible to behold. He censures both Primarchs, orders Magnus to submit to testing by the Custodian Guard immediately, and when Magnus refuses, threatens him with execution. Magnus flees with his legion, taking them into deep space, and for 3 years, the 1,000 Sons are renegades, not yet traitors, but no longer fully part of the Imperium, existing in a gray zone where they conduct their own operations and avoid contact with other Imperial forces. During this time, the mutations accelerate, and Magnus makes a terrible discovery. His sons are dying, their flesh failing as the psychic energies they wield burn through their mortal bodies faster than even Astartes' physiology can repair. He has a choice: watch his legion die slowly, turn himself in to the Emperor, and hope for mercy he knows will not come, or accept help from the entities in the warp that have been whispering to him for decades, promising that they can stabilize the mutations, that they can save his sons if only he will accept their blessing. Magnus makes the only choice a father can make. He damns himself and his entire legion to save them from a slower death, and the 1,000 Sons become what they were always going to become, what the Emperor feared from the moment he first saw Magnus's psychic potential: a legion of sorcerers bound to chaos, powerful and terrible, and lost forever to the Imperium they once served. When news of Magnus's fall reaches the wider Imperium, it sends shockwaves through every legion. If a Primarch can fall to chaos, if even the Emperor's sons are not immune to corruption, then what hope does anyone else have? Some legions respond with increased paranoia, conducting purges within their own ranks to root out any hint of warp taint. Others respond with fatalism, concluding that corruption is inevitable, and the only question is when, not if, they will fall. And a few, the ones whose Primarchs have already been touched by chaos's influence, see Magnus's fall as permission, as proof that betrayal is possible, that the Emperor can be defied and survived. Lorgar openly celebrates, preaching that Magnus has found enlightenment, that his damnation is actually apotheosis, that the 1,000 Sons are the vanguard of humanity's inevitable evolution. He is censured again, confined to his flagship under custodian guard, but his words have already spread, and they find receptive audiences in legions whose loyalty is fraying, whose faith in the Emperor's plan has been eroded by 2.5 centuries of war without apparent purpose. The Council of Nicaea never happens in this timeline. Without Terra to serve as the neutral meeting ground, without the Imperial Palace's amphitheaters to host a grand debate about the use of psychic powers, the Imperium never formally addresses the question of whether psykers are tools or threats, whether sorcery can be safely practiced or must be absolutely banned. This absence of clarity allows every legion to develop its own policy, which means the 1,000 Sons' fall cannot be framed as a violation of established law. It is just one more tragic outcome in a galaxy full of tragedies. Some Primarchs call for Magnus to be hunted down and destroyed. Others advocate for attempting negotiation, for bringing him back into the fold if possible. The Stability Council debates for months without reaching consensus, and eventually the matter is tabled, filed away as a problem to be addressed when resources permit, which means never, because resources never permit, because there is always a more immediate crisis demanding attention. Terra's final clue arrives from an unlikely source, an Eldar Farseer who approaches an Imperial fleet under flag of truce and delivers a message wrapped in riddles and prophecy. The message suggests that Terra is not lost but hidden, that it exists behind a veil woven by powers that fear what humanity might become, and that the veil can be pierced only by one who understands that some doors should remain closed. The Emperor interrogates the Farseer personally, and what passes between them is never recorded, but when the audience ends, the Eldar is released unharmed, and the Emperor orders his fleet to a set of coordinates that appear nowhere in any Imperial star chart. He tells no one what he expects to find there, not even Malkador, who has stood by his side for millennia. He goes alone, taking only the custodian guard and a small fleet of the fastest ships humanity has ever built, and he leaves behind an Imperium that is barely holding together, an empire of 1,000,000 worlds that depends on his authority but has learned to function without his presence. And that ambiguity is about to tear everything apart. The Emperor finds Terra. After 250 years of searching, he locates the coordinates, navigates the warp storms that have hidden humanity's birthworld for centuries, and his fleet, translates into real space above the planet where human civilization began. But what he finds there stops him cold, freezes even his ancient hearts with a horror he has not felt since the dark age of technology. Terra is not abandoned, not waiting for humanity to return and reclaim it. Terra is occupied. The planet teems with life, but it is not human life, or if it ever was, it has been so transformed by warp exposure that no baseline human would recognize it as kin. Daemons walk openly under Terra's yellow sun, and in the ruins of what should be the Imperial palace, something that calls itself Emperor sits on a throne of bone and brass and laughs with a voice that echoes in the warp loud enough to be heard across the galaxy. It is a trap. It has always been a trap. The Chaos Gods have held Terra hostage for centuries, have used it as bait to draw the Emperor away from his Imperium, to keep him searching and distracted while they corrupted his sons and infiltrated his legions. And, now that he has finally found it, now that he stands in orbit above the world he remembers, the world where he has walked since before human history was recorded, he cannot reclaim it without triggering a confrontation that might destroy the entire Sol system and everyone within 50 light-years. The daemon on the throne is an aspect of Chaos Undivided, a gestalt entity formed from the combined will of all 4 dark gods, and it is powerful enough to fight the Emperor to a standstill, possibly powerful enough to kill him if he commits fully to the attack. And even if he wins, even if he can destroy the daemon and purge Terra of Chaos's taint, the effort will leave him too weak to prevent the other catastrophes building across his Imperium, will render him unable to stop the heresy that is about to erupt across a dozen sectors simultaneously. The Emperor makes his choice. He withdraws. He does not land, does not attempt to reconquer Terra, does not even allow his fleet to enter orbit, long enough for detailed scans. He turns away from humanity's birthworld and returns to the Imperium, and the decision breaks something in him, some final restraint or hope that has kept him human despite millennia of existence. When he returns to the Stability Council's headquarters currently housed aboard a massive space station that serves as the Imperium's mobile capital, he is changed. His golden eyes have gone cold. His voice, when he speaks, carries an edge of desperation that terrifies those who hear it. He tells the Council what he found, and the knowledge spreads through the Imperium's leadership like poison. Terra is lost, perhaps permanently, and without it, without the throne that should anchor reality, without the webway that should free humanity from warp travel, without the foundation on which the Imperium was supposed to be built, they are doomed. The Imperium can continue, can even thrive for centuries or millennia, but it will always be incomplete, always be vulnerable, always be one major crisis away from collapse. The knowledge that Terra is held by chaos, that humanity's birthworld has been turned into a demon world, destroys morale across the Imperial forces faster than any military defeat could manage. Soldiers who have fought for centuries begin to question what they are fighting for. If Terra is already lost, if the Emperor himself cannot reclaim it, then what is the point of the Great Crusade? What are they conquering all these worlds to protect? The desertions begin slowly, individual soldiers going absent without leave, small units disappearing from their posts, but within months, entire regiments are vanishing. Ships are being reported lost when they have actually just decided to stop reporting, and the centrifugal forces that have been building for 2.5 centuries suddenly have nothing holding them in check. The Imperium begins to come apart, not through external conquest but through internal dissolution, as planets and systems and entire sectors decide that if there is no Terra, if there is no center, then perhaps they are better off governing themselves, making their own accommodations with whatever powers, Chaos or Xenos, offer them protection. Horus stands before the Stability Council and makes the speech that will define his place in history, though no one who hears it yet understands the full implications. He argues that Terra's loss, while tragic, changes nothing essential about the Imperium's mission. Humanity still needs protection from Xenos and Chaos. The Great Crusade still has value. The million worlds they have conquered still need governance and defense. What has changed is that the Imperium can no longer afford to wait for the Emperor to solve every problem, can no longer organize itself around one man's vision, when that man has spent centuries chasing a world that no longer exists as anything but a chaos-corrupted ruin. The Imperium needs new leadership, distributed leadership, primarchs who can act independently but in concert, who can hold the Empire together through force of will and strategic coordination. And if the Emperor cannot provide that leadership, if his failure to reclaim Terra has proven that even he has limitations, then perhaps it is time for him to step aside, to acknowledge that his dream of unity died when Terra fell to chaos, and to allow his sons, who have never failed him, to build something new from the ashes. The speech is reasonable, measured, even respectful in its phrasing. It is also the first open suggestion from any Primarch that the Emperor might need to abdicate, and the reaction splits the council instantly. Half the Primarchs present agree with Horus, or at least acknowledge that he raises valid points. The other half is appalled, views the suggestion as borderline heresy, and looks to the Emperor to strike Horus down for his presumption. But the Emperor does not strike. He sits on his makeshift throne, stares at his favored son, and says nothing, absolutely nothing, for a span of seconds that feels like hours. When he finally speaks, his words are quiet, almost gentle, and that gentleness is more terrifying than any rage could be. He tells Horus that he understands, that the burden of holding the Imperium together has fallen disproportionately on the War Master's shoulders, that perhaps it is time for a reorganization of command structures. He does not address the question of abdication. He does not defend his decision to withdraw from Terra rather than fight for it. He simply acknowledges the problem and promises to consider solutions, and then he dismisses the council and retreats to his private chambers, where even Malcador is not permitted to follow. Malcador knows what is happening because he has seen it before, millennia ago, in the faces of tyrants and emperors who realized their empires were crumbling. The Emperor is breaking under the weight of accumulated failures, the loss of Terra, being merely the final straw on a burden that has been growing unbearable for centuries. Without Terra, without the Golden Throne to focus his psychic might, without the Webway project to give humanity an escape from the warp's hunger, the Emperor's grand plan for humanity's salvation has failed, and he is too old, too proud, too fundamentally alone to accept that failure and adapt. Malcador attempts an intervention, tries to convince his oldest friend that the Imperium can survive Terra's loss, that they can build something new even without the foundation they planned for, but the Emperor will not listen. He has withdrawn into himself, into calculations and contingencies that he shares with no one, and Malcador leaves the audience with the terrible knowledge that he may have just spoken to the Emperor for the last time as anything resembling equals. The heresy, when it finally erupts, does so in multiple locations simultaneously, which is how you know it has been planned for years, coordinated through astropathic networks that have been corrupted so gradually that no one noticed the decay. Horus does not fire the first shot. He is too smart for that, too aware that open rebellion would unite the loyalist Primarchs against him. Instead, the first shot comes from Lorgar, who declares the Imperial truth a lie, and the Emperor a false god, who has led humanity to the brink of extinction through arrogance and incompetence. The word-bearers rise in rebellion, but they do not do so alone. Within hours, reports flood into the Stability Council of other legions declaring for Lorgar, of fleet elements turning traitor, of entire sectors pledging allegiance to a new order that will embrace humanity's psychic potential rather than fear it, that will make peace with the powers in the warp rather than fighting an unwinnable war. The Night Lords, the Emperor's children, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, the Thousand Sons who are already damned, the Iron Warriors whose bitterness has finally found an outlet, the Alpha Legion whose true loyalties no one has ever fully understood, all of them declare against the Emperor in a cascade of betrayals that shatters the Imperium's command structure in a single day. Horus waits. For 3 days, he maintains strict neutrality, sending messages to both sides, urging negotiation, attempting to position himself as the reasonable mediator who can prevent civil war. But on the 4th day, when it becomes clear that the loyalist Primarchs will not negotiate with traitors, when Dawn and Guilliman and the Lion begin mobilizing their legions to crush the rebellion, Horus makes his choice. He sides with the traitors, not because he believes in their cause, but because he has calculated that the Emperor's Imperium is doomed regardless of who wins the war, and by joining the rebellion, he can at least ensure that something survives, that the infrastructure and institutions he has spent decades building will not be destroyed in the fighting. He frames his decision as pragmatic, as choosing the lesser evil, but the effect is the same as if he had planned the rebellion from the start. With the War Master's defection, half the Imperium's military strength goes with him, and what should have been a brief civil war becomes a galaxy-spanning catastrophe that will burn for years. The Loyalist Primarchs respond with shock and fury, but they respond, and this is the one advantage they possess. They are genuinely loyal, genuinely committed to the Emperor's vision, and they will fight with the desperation of those who have nothing left to lose. Rogel Dawn begins constructing defenses around the space station that serves as the Imperium's mobile capital, turning it into a fortress that would make Terra's Imperial palace jealous. Rabut Gilaman mobilizes Ultramar's resources and begins a strategic retreat, consolidating Loyalist forces in the galactic east, where they can establish a defensible perimeter. Leman Russ and his Space Wolves, still recovering from their battle with the Thousand Suns, nevertheless throw themselves into the fighting with savage determination, hunting traitor forces through the void with the patience of Fenrisian wolves. Sanguinius and his Blood Angels become the fire brigade of the Loyalist cause, deploying wherever the fighting is fiercest, plugging gaps in the defensive lines with their lives. And the Lion, master of secrets and hidden wars, begins a campaign of systematic extermination against traitor supply lines and command structures, proving that the Dark Angels can be just as ruthless as any traitor legion when the cause demands it. But the traitors have numbers and momentum, and they have something else: the full backing of the Chaos Gods, who have been waiting for this moment since the Great Crusade began. The warp storms that have been building for decades suddenly intensify, cutting off Loyalist sectors from reinforcement, isolating fleets, preventing coordination. Daemonic manifestations become routine rather than exceptional, with lesser daemons appearing on battlefields to tip engagements in the traitor's favor, and greater daemons taking personal interest in killing Loyalist champions. Fulgrim leads the Emperor's children in raids that prioritize art over victory, conquering worlds just to arrange their populations in aesthetically pleasing patterns of death, and the madness of his actions spreads corruption faster than the Loyalists can purge it. Angron and the World Eaters have finally found the war they always wanted, a conflict brutal and total enough to satisfy their hunger for violence, and they tear through Loyalist defenses like chainsaws through flesh, leaving nothing behind but corpses and ruins. Mortarion brings the Death Guard's methodical approach to the rebellion, conducting sieges that last months or years, slowly suffocating Loyalist strongholds until their defenders have no choice but to surrender or die, and those who surrender find that death would have been preferable. Perturabo wages the war he has always dreamed of waging, a conflict of pure mathematics where logistics and siegecraft matter more than heroism or valor. He identifies key nodes in the Loyalist supply network and systematically destroys them, not with glorious charges but with calculated bombardments and patient starvation tactics. His Iron Warriors become the terror of Loyalist space, not because they are the most brutal but because they are the most inevitable once Perturabo commits to destroying a target. That target will fall. It is only a question of when and how many resources the Loyalists are willing to waste trying to prevent it. The Loyalists hate him more than any other traitor Primarch because he proves that the rebellion is not just a moment of madness or corruption, but a carefully planned military operation that could actually succeed. Lorgar preaches. It is what he has always done, what he was made to do, and in the chaos of civil war, his sermons find audiences that would have rejected them in peacetime. He speaks to soldiers who have watched their comrades die for reasons no one can explain, to civilians who have seen their worlds burn and wondered why the Emperor allowed it, to psychers who have been hunted and persecuted for gifts they never asked for. He tells them that the Emperor lied, that there are gods in the warp, that these gods offer purpose and meaning and power to those who worship them, that humanity's salvation lies not in denying the warp but in embracing it, in accepting the gifts the dark gods offer, and becoming something greater than baseline humanity could ever achieve. It is persuasive because it contains truth. There are gods in the warp, they do offer power, and the Emperor has lied about their nature and existence. The fact that worshipping these gods means eternal damnation, that their gifts are curses in disguise, that embracing chaos means losing. Everything that makes you human, these details Lorgar omits, and by the time his converts learn the truth, it is far too late to turn back. Magnus wages his own war, a psychic conflict that takes place in the warp as much as in real space. The Thousand Suns have become living weapons, sorcerers who can unmake fleets with rituals, who can turn loyalist psykers against their own sides, who can summon daemons with a precision and reliability that terrifies even other traitor legions. Magnus himself duels loyalist psykers and wins every engagement, his mastery of the warp unmatched by any save the Emperor himself. And there are rumors, whispered in the deepest parts of loyalist command structures, that Magnus is searching for something, some warp-based weapon or ritual that will allow him to challenge even the Emperor's psychic might. Whether these rumors are true or disinformation spread by the Alpha Legion, no one can say. But they add to the sense of apocalyptic stakes, the feeling that this war is not just about political control, but about the fundamental nature of reality itself. The Emperor leads from the front because he has no choice, because without Terra to serve as his power base, he cannot coordinate the defense from a secure location. His flagship becomes the heart of the loyalist resistance, and wherever it appears, the tide of battle shifts. He wields powers that should not be possible, that violate every known law of physics and metaphysics, destroying traitor vessels with thought, banishing greater daemons with a gesture, manifesting psychic phenomena that leave even his custodian guards stunned by their magnitude. But even he cannot be everywhere at once, and the traitors know this, so they employ a strategy of dispersion, attacking in 100 locations simultaneously, forcing the Emperor to choose which battles to fight and which to abandon. Every choice costs lives, costs worlds, costs pieces of the Imperium that will never be recovered, and with each loss, the Emperor's options narrow, his strategic position deteriorates, until it becomes clear that the Loyalists are not winning this war but merely postponing their ultimate defeat. Malcador holds together what remains of the Imperial administration, coordinating logistics, maintaining astropathic communication networks, ensuring that Loyalist forces receive ammunition and supplies even as the Imperium crumbles around them. He is burning himself out doing it, using his psychic powers to supplement failing infrastructure, holding open warp routes through sheer force of will when the warp storms threaten to isolate Loyalist sectors completely. He knows he is dying, can feel his life force depleting with every day that passes, but he persists because someone must, because if the administration fails, the military forces will starve even if they win every battle. He sends messengers to neutral Primarchs, those who have not yet committed to either side, begging them to support the Loyalists, or at least maintain neutrality, but one by one, they refuse or hedge or make demands that cannot be met. And Malcador watches the Imperium fragment into warlord territories, each Primarch becoming a king of his own domain, and he understands that even if the Loyalists win the military conflict, the Imperium as a unified entity is already dead. The siege of the mobile capital lasts for 3 years and costs more lives than any battle in human history. Horus commits 8 traitor legions to the assault, along with daemonic reinforcements that materialize directly into the station's corridors, bypassing the void shields through warp portals that the traitors have learned to open with sickening reliability. Dawn's defenses are masterpieces of military engineering, every corridor a killing ground, every junction a fortress within a fortress. But the traitors have numbers and chaos's blessings and a willingness to spend lives without limit. The Death Guard introduces plagues that turn defenders into shambling vectors of disease. The Emperor's children deploy sonic weaponry that drives Loyalists mad before killing them. The World Eaters simply charge again and again and again, accepting casualties that would break any other force, grinding forward through sheer bloody-minded aggression. And the Word-Bearers conduct rituals in the station's lower levels, corrupting the very structure of the fortress, turning Dawn's masterwork against itself as bulkheads become mouths that bite, As floors become acid that dissolves boots, as air recyclers begin pumping warp-tainted atmosphere that causes mutations in those who breathe it. The final battle takes place in the throne room that the Emperor has never truly occupied, a symbolic space at the heart of the mobile capital where his command throne sits empty more often than not. Horus leads the assault personally, fighting through the custodian guard with a power that should not be possible for even a Blaith Primarch. And when he finally stands before the Emperor, everyone present understands that this is the moment the entire war has been building toward. Father and son face each other across a chamber littered with the bodies of the Imperium's finest warriors, and for a moment there is silence, a pause where either could speak, could attempt reconciliation, could find some path forward that does not end in death. But the moment passes. Horus attacks, and the Emperor defends. And the duel that follows cannot adequately be described because it takes place on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. In the physical world, it is a clash of weapons and strength, the Emperor's flaming sword against Horus's lightning claw, both combatants moving with speed that makes them blurs to mortal perception. In the psychic realm, it is a battle of wills. The Emperor's disciplined might against Horus's raw power amplified by Chaos's blessings, both of them striking at each other's souls, attempting to unmake the other from the inside. And in the warp, it is something stranger. A confrontation between the Emperor's vision of what humanity should become and the Chaos God's vision, with Horus serving as their avatar, their voice, their hand in the Imperium. The entire station shakes with the force of their conflict, reality itself straining under the weight of powers that were never meant to clash so directly. The Emperor wins, but barely, and at a cost that leaves him crippled in ways that will never heal. He strikes Horus down with a psychic blow that obliterates his favored son's soul, erasing him so completely that even the Chaos Gods cannot resurrect him. But in doing so, the Emperor expends so much of his power that his physical form begins to fail. Horus's dying strike, empowered by all four dark gods in their final attempt to kill their greatest enemy, punches through the Emperor's defenses and inflicts wounds that would kill even a Primarch instantly. The Emperor survives, only because he is not merely a Primarch, not even merely a human, but something else. Something that has existed for so long that even he might not remember what he originally was, and that something refuses to die even when death would be a mercy. Malcador finds him in the ruins of the throne room, surrounded by dead custodians and the disintegrating remains of what was once Horus, and understands immediately that everything has changed. The Emperor is alive but cannot move, cannot speak except in psychic whispers, cannot do anything but maintain the barest presence in the Imperium, while the rest of his consciousness fights a desperate rearguard action in the warp against chaos entities that smell his weakness and converge like sharks drawn to blood. Malcador makes a decision that will haunt what remains of humanity forever. He uses his own psychic power to stabilize the Emperor, to serve as a psychic life support system, burning through his remaining life force at an accelerated rate to keep his oldest friend anchored to reality. The Emperor tries to refuse, tries to tell Malcador to save himself, but Malcador ignores him, and for once, the Emperor lacks the strength to enforce his will. Together, linked in a psychic embrace that is slowly killing them both, they hold the Imperium together for one more day, one more week, one more month, long enough for the scattered loyalist forces to regroup, long enough for the traitors, shocked by Horus's death, to hesitate and give ground. The traitor legions fracture without Horus to unite them. Some, like the word-bearers, retreat into the Eye of Terra to build daemon worlds where they can worship their gods in peace. Others, like the Iron Warriors, establish independent fiefdoms in the galactic fringes and wage their own wars for their own reasons. The Emperor's children scatter into warbands, each pursuing its own definition of perfection, each more depraved than the last. The World Eaters continue fighting because fighting is all they know, selling their services as mercenaries to anyone who offers them a good battle. And the Death Guard methodically conquer a sector near the Eye of Terra, transforming it into a plague garden where Nurgle's blessings are considered holy and mutation is celebrated rather than purged. The great heresy ends not with a decisive victory for either side, but with exhaustion, with both loyalists and traitors too depleted to continue fighting on the scale the war has demanded. The Imperium that survives is unrecognizable from the one that existed before the heresy. Half its territory is gone, claimed by traitors or lost to warp storms or simply cut off by communication failures that have never been repaired. Half its primarchs are dead or traitor or missing, presumed dead. Its military strength has been reduced to a shadow of what it once was, with entire legions destroyed and the survivors so scattered that coordinated operations are nearly impossible. And its emperor, the being who built the Imperium through sheer force of will and vision, is a broken shell, kept alive only by Malcador's sacrifice and the improvised life support systems that Mechanicum tech priests rig around what has become his permanent throne, not the Golden Throne, because that exists on a Terra they cannot reach, but a crude imitation built from whatever materials are available, a throne of necessity rather than grandeur. Malcador dies after 2 years serving as the Emperor's life support. His body simply gives out, consumed by the effort of keeping the Emperor anchored to reality, and when he passes, the psychic scream of his death echoes through the warp loud enough that every astropath in the Imperium feels it. The Emperor is left alone on his improvised throne, too weak to move, barely strong enough to maintain consciousness, and the Imperium faces a choice: let him die and face whatever comes after, or find a way to sustain him indefinitely, to keep him alive, even if he can never truly live again, because his psychic presence is the only thing preventing the warp from consuming every human world simultaneously. The solution they devise is monstrous. 1,000 psychers per day, fed to the throne, their life force and psychic energy consumed to fuel the Emperor's continued existence. It is a horrifying expense, a sacrifice that would have been unthinkable before the heresy, but in the aftermath of the war, with chaos's true nature revealed, and the alternative being immediate extinction, it becomes policy. The black ships are commissioned, vessels that travel between worlds collecting psychers, and the infrastructure of oppression that will define the Imperium for the next 10,000 years begins to crystallize. Without Terra to serve as a beacon of hope, without the Emperor active and leading, the Imperium becomes a bureaucratic nightmare. A decaying empire held together by fear and inertia, and the million daily sacrifices of those deemed expendable. The remaining loyalist primarchs cannot agree on what to do next. Guilliman wants to consolidate, to build Ultramar into an example of what the Imperium could become, rational and efficient and humane. Dawn wants to fortify, to build defenses so strong that no enemy can ever threaten humanity's remaining territories again. The Lion wants to hunt, to pursue every traitor legion into whatever hell they have fled to and destroy them to the last Astartes. Russ, broken by his failures, takes his space wolves on a quest into the Eye of Terra, searching for the Tree of Life from Fenrisian mythology, convinced that its fruit could heal the Emperor, and he is never seen again. Vulcan, horrified by what the Imperium has become, disappears into the galactic south with his salamanders, promising to return when humanity has regained its soul. Sanguinius alone remains at the Emperor's side, guardian of the throne, and even he is changing, his wings darkening, his visions becoming less prophecy and more curse, as if proximity to the Emperor's suffering is infecting him with despair. The Astronomican that eventually manifests is not what it should be. Without Terra, without the proper infrastructure, without the Emperor's full power to fuel it, the psychic beacon that guides ships through the warp is weak, flickering, unreliable. Navigators can sometimes perceive it, but it gutters in and out, forcing ships to travel in short hops rather than the long journeys that the Great Crusade made routine. Travel times between worlds increase dramatically. Sectors that were once connected by regular shipping routes become isolated for months or years at a time. And in the darkness between the beacon's pulses, things move. Warp entities that hunt for lost ships, that board and corrupt and send the vessels onward as plague ships carrying chaos's taint to unsuspecting worlds. The Imperium shrinks not through conquest but through isolation, worlds losing contact with their neighbors and eventually forgetting that they were ever part of something larger. The Xenos return with a vengeance. The Orcs, sensing weakness, launch massive WAAGHs that carve through Imperial space, conquering and destroying with the enthusiasm of children pulling wings off insects. The Eldar craft worlds begin raiding Imperial worlds for slaves and sport, having concluded that humanity is doomed anyway and might as well be exploited before the end. The Necrons wake in greater numbers, their tomb worlds detecting the warp storms and correctly identifying them as evidence that the younger races have lost control of the situation, and they begin methodical campaigns to exterminate or re-enslave what remains of organic life in the galaxy. And new threats emerge. Xenos species that the Great Crusade never encountered because they existed in regions that are now cut off or corrupted, species that view the weakened Imperium as prey rather than predator. Terra remains in Chaos hands, a daemon world that serves as a mockery of everything the Imperium stands for. The entity that claims to be Emperor there continues to rule from the Bone Throne, and sometimes it broadcasts messages that are picked up by Imperial astropaths, messages that claim the true Emperor is dead, that the being on the Imperium's improvised throne is a corpse animated by desperation, that humanity should submit to chaos because resistance is futile and painful, and submission offers pleasures beyond mortal comprehension. Most Imperial citizens never hear these messages because they are suppressed by the Inquisition, an organization that forms in the heresy's aftermath specifically to hunt heresy and mutation, and any knowledge that might destabilize what little stability remains. But those who do hear the messages are often corrupted by them, because the daemon speaks truth, mixed with lies in proportions that make them impossible to separate. And truth, even horrible truth, has power that lies alone cannot match. The Imperium survives. This is the miracle, and the tragedy, it survives. Not as the enlightened empire the Emperor envisioned, not as the unity that would bring reason and science and prosperity to every human world, but as a theocratic nightmare where the Emperor is worshipped as a god despite his explicit rejection of that role, where psychers are hunted and fed to a throne to keep a dying man from becoming a corpse, where innovation is heresy and the only virtue is obedience, where hope has been replaced by duty and happiness, by the grim satisfaction of surviving one more day. It survives for 10,000 years like this, rotting from within, holding off external threats through sheer bloody-minded refusal to die, sacrificing billions to maintain a status quo that benefits no one but at least prevents chaos from consuming everything. But in the darkness, as the Imperium grinds forward through its slow apocalypse, there are those who remember what was supposed to be. Scattered across 1,000,000 worlds are libraries and data vaults that contain fragments of the Great Crusade's history, corrupted texts that speak of a time when the Emperor walked among humanity, when the Primarchs were heroes rather than legends or traitors, when unity meant something more than uniformity under threat of death. These texts are heretical by definition, prohibited by the Inquisition, burned wherever they are found. But you cannot burn information from 1,000,000 worlds, cannot purge knowledge that is scattered across light years, and so the stories persist, passed down in secret, whispered in the quiet places where the Imperium's reach falters. And some who hear these stories begin to ask dangerous questions. They ask what happened to Terra. They ask whether the Emperor on the throne is the same being who led the Great Crusade or something else, something that has replaced him or usurped his name. They ask whether the Imperium's cruelty is necessary or merely traditional, whether the daily sacrifices that feed the throne could be replaced with something less horrible if anyone bothered to research alternatives. They ask these questions quietly, carefully, because asking them openly means death, but the questions themselves are weapons, seeds of doubt that grow in the darkness and produce strange fruit. In the eye of terror, the traitor legions watch the Imperium's slow decay and laugh. They have won, not through military victory but through corruption, by transforming the Emperor's dream into a nightmare that he is too weak to correct, by ensuring that even if the Imperium survives forever, it survives as a monument to failure. Lorgar preaches to daemon congregations about how the imperial truth became the imperial creed, how the emperor who rejected divinity became a god in death, how humanity's enlightenment became its damnation. Magnus conducts experiments in his library fortress, searching for ways to extract the emperor's soul from his rotting body so that Siench can claim it properly. Fulgrim creates art from suffering, entire worlds transformed into sculptures of agony that exist purely for aesthetic effect. And in the warp, the Chaos Gods grow fat on humanity's devotion, on the fear and anger and despair and pride that 10,000 years of decay have generated, and they are patient because they have already won, because the Imperium is theirs in all but name, because even if every human falls to chaos tomorrow, they will have fed well for millennia first. The Emperor's consciousness, what remains of it, exists in a state of constant psychic warfare. He fights daemons in the warp continuously, an endless battle that never allows rest, never permits consciousness to focus on the materium for more than brief moments. Sometimes, in the seconds between breaths, between heartbeats sustained by machines and sacrifice, he remembers Terra as it was, remembers the yellow sun and the mountains where he built his palace, remembers the hope he felt when he imagined humanity united and enlightened and safe. But the memories are torture now, reminders of what was lost, what he failed to protect, what his obsessive search prevented him from building elsewhere. If he could speak, he might apologize, might tell his Imperium that he is sorry, that he made mistakes, that perhaps Horus was right to suggest abdication. But he cannot speak, can only fight, can only hold the line against chaos's full assault while his empire decays around the shell of his body. The custodian guard stands vigil around the improvised throne, as they have for 10,000 years, as they will continue until the last of them falls. They have failed their primary purpose. Terra is lost. The palace was never built. The emperor they were created to protect is less a living being and more a weapon aimed at the warp. But they endure because duty is all they have, because the alternative to standing watch is admitting that their existence was pointless, that they were created for a function that will never be needed. New custodians are still created, cloned from the genetic templates of the original 10,000, but they are degraded copies, lacking the perfect transhuman excellence of their predecessors. And with each generation, they are a little weaker, a little less perfect, a slow decline that mirrors the Imperium's own decay. The space around the improvised throne has become a pilgrimage site for those few who are permitted to approach. Saints and madmen, generals and inquisitors, all come seeking guidance from the Emperor, hoping for a sign, a vision, a psychic whisper that will tell them what to do, how to save the Imperium, how to reverse the decay. Most receive nothing but silence. A few receive visions, but the visions are fragmentary, contradictory, possibly nothing more than their own minds reflecting back their fears and hopes rather than genuine communication from the Emperor. And a very few receive something else, something that might be the Emperor's true will or might be daemons masquerading as his voice. Instructions that lead them to commit acts of incredible heroism or terrible atrocity, and no one can say with certainty which is which. The question that defines this Imperium, the question that echoes through 10 millennia of decline, is whether any of it was worth it. Would humanity have been better served by the Emperor accepting Terra's loss, by him building something new without obsessing over the past? Could the heresy have been prevented if he had been present, attentive, focused on his sons rather than on coordinates and warp storms? Might a smaller Imperium, one limited to a few thousand worlds, have been more stable, more humane, more capable of actual progress rather than merely surviving? These are questions that historians debate in secret, that philosophers whisper in forbidden texts, that every imperial citizen who has ever questioned the system has pondered in the quiet darkness before sleep. And the answer, the terrible answer, is that there is no answer. The Emperor made choices based on information and priorities that no one else fully understood. Perhaps he was right to search for Terra. Perhaps there was something there that could have saved everything if only he had found it sooner. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps his obsession doomed humanity to this slow death. Perhaps it would have made no difference. Perhaps the Chaos Gods would have found a way to corrupt the Imperium regardless, because that is what they do, that is their nature, And no amount of planning or power can prevent entropy when entropy is embodied in conscious entities who want your destruction. The only certainty is that humanity survives, diminished and corrupted and barely recognizable as the species that once dreamed of conquering the stars, but surviving nonetheless. And in a galaxy as hostile as this one has become, perhaps survival is victory enough. The story ends where it began, with silence in the warp where the Astronomican should burn. But now that silence is not absence but presence, not the empty dark before humanity's light, but the suffocating weight of chaos pressing against reality's boundaries, held back only by the continuous sacrifice of thousands and the dying will of a being who can neither live nor die. This is the Imperium without Terra, the nightmare that finding humanity's birthworld prevented, the timeline where everything went wrong, not through any single catastrophic failure, but through the accumulation of 1,000 smaller failures, each one survivable, together forming a chain that dragged civilization back into darkness. And in that darkness, humanity endures, not thriving, not progressing, not enlightened or united or safe, but enduring, always enduring, because endurance is what humans do best. And even in the worst possible timeline, even in an Imperium without hope or heart or home, that endurance means something, even if only to the billions who live and die without ever knowing what could have been.